So is what is following the thread, right? And correct me if any of this, we're kind of working it now, right?
Sure.
Like, is what you're saying that in what you're saying, would we acknowledge that there's still winners and losers in that, right? Because if you take that collective approach, and let's even say you have the philosopher king, to use Plato's term, who's
Sure.
kind of calling the shots here, who you have faith is actually seeing the big picture, considering it all that. Um, Still within that, the collective good is not the complete good, right? I think there's a distinction there, right? And let's use an extreme example to play this out. You could have somebody who's a pedophile, who has a deep desire to molest or hurt children in some
Sure.
way, who
Sure.
says, okay, the collective good says that's bad. We're going to punish those people. We're not going to allow that to happen. Most people are good with that. We're all good. But you're going to have people that lose. Now you can move off that spectrum and come close to the middle, and you have people that have whatever other views they have that we say, well, that doesn't quite fit into the collective good. So is there an acknowledgement? And if so, are we okay with it that with that approach, you're still going to have people who lose out and suffer in some way because it's not what is ideal or best for them?
Well, I think even though it's an extreme use case, it actually fits the model very well, because if you think about that mathematically, again, we all have more in common than we don't. And there are some fringe edge cases. And I think in society, we're so focused on what's happening out here instead of what's happening here. Where, I mean, good 60, 70% of us can agree on almost everything here. And when we get outside, we're so focused on issue A, B, C, or D that we actually lose sight of what we have.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the biggest problems that I view. One, we can't talk to each other anymore. It seems like we can't for the most part. I mean, and we obviously can, but we don't. And I think that's a significant issue, right? Because that's how you solve problems, right? When you wars start when you can't communicate, right? And I don't care if it's a political war, physical war,
It's
everything, right? And I again, the distribution of people that would fall into that category of being okay with pedophilia or something like that are very small in comparison to the group. And if the group's values are that that's bad, then yeah, they should certainly be ostracized, because that pulls away from what's common and what's good and the way that we want to develop ourselves and our children and our society. Right. So, but I've never looked at it as winners and losers. I think that's an interesting perspective for me. I never looked at the world as like, okay, these people are winning and these people are losing. I just think of it as, if I went against what was good here, defined as good here, to the 70th percentile, we're very rarely are we going to get anywhere approximating 100%.
Right.
If you just analyze it statistically and drop it out there, right? But if you can get to 60 or 70%, you're doing fantastic.
Well, if you zoom out on that, or extrapolate out on that, is that mean that, use that same 60 to 70%, does that mean that the reality of life is that, and this I guess gets back to the winners or losers point, like there's no utopia. There's no scenario where it's 100% fit, where everybody feels like, yes, this value system is exactly perfect for me and what I want. It would be great if it was, but that's unrealistic. Therefore, we have to do the practical thing and optimize for the greatest overall good. The 70% is kind of the best we can get to and hit that. Yes. And that gets back to it, where you're gonna inevitably have people, and this is what I think people perhaps don't want to acknowledge or admit, is that the world in that way is an ugly place. It is a situation where you're never going to have everybody feeling great and happy about what it is. And it changes through time, right? The trends, sure. Society, values change. But is that like an inconvenient truth about life that, 70% is the best we're going to get?
It seems to be. Now, even if you had a utopian society, right? And what would that look like? I've thought about this extensively. Everybody would have to agree with each other on almost everything. So they would have to be generally almost way more agreeable than the average human being. Because if that weren't the case, right, then we just end up where we are right now, which is, and then what happens in those societies, right, is all it takes is one person who is significantly disagreeable or narcissistic to topple that entire society, right? So these checks, and the way that I'm looking at it, not in so much as what's the perfect system, but what's the perfect system for human beings, right? So those are two different questions, yes. Right? I think a lot of times we go off in theory, and honestly, you look at Marxist policy and communism, and you think, okay, theoretically that's great, okay, on paper great, in reality, human beings are still operating that system. So it's like, do you give absolute control of all decisions to a handful of people? And then does that handful of people keep an altruistic outlook on everything in life for everybody else around them except for themselves? And it doesn't act in nepotistic ways, right? At best, the answer to that question, it seems to be no.